it's our pleasure to have you here today to share ideas and at this lunchtime to hear from our Vice Chair, Philip Jefferson. So I would like to do a little housekeeping first. We're going to do some Q&A after Vice Chair's remarks. And so on your tables, you'll see a little card that has a Slido QR code. If you could just put that in your phone, you can enter your questions in there, and I'll take them from the iPad, and we'll use that to facilitate the Q&A after his remarks. So I don't think the Vice Chair really needs much of an introduction in this audience, but we have a lot of folks on live stream, so I want to make sure that I do it justice. Dr. Philip Jefferson joined the Federal Reserve Board as governor in May of 2022, just as the FOMC began increasing interest rates to bring down inflation, and then became the Vice Chair of the board in September of 2023. This is a homecoming of sorts. Dr. Jefferson received his PhD from UVA, and prior to his current roles, Dr. Jefferson was the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Paul Freeland Professor of Economics at Davidson College, and formerly an economist at the Board of Governors. I did a quick search of Jefferson's prior work while at the board, and I found a paper entitled Home Base and Monetary Base Rules, Elementary Evidence from the 1980s and 1990s. This paper assesses monetary base rules for conducting monetary policy, and I couldn't help but think so much has changed since you wrote that paper. And we very much look forward to hearing your remarks today about monetary policy and central bank communication. So please join me in welcoming Vice Chair Philip Jefferson.
Thank you, Paula, for your kind words and the opportunity to speak with this group. It's always wonderful to be back in Georgia and here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And it's an honor to speak at a conference co-organized by the University of Virginia, where I received my PhD. You have heard already today about financial markets and the banking system. To add to that picture, I would like to share with you my outlook for the U.S. economy and my views of appropriate monetary policy. But before that, I want to touch on the importance of central bank communications, and particularly the evolution of Fed communications. One of the reasons I so appreciate the opportunity to speak at events like this is because speeches are an important part of how the Federal Reserve delivers on its mission to the American people. Like my colleagues on the Federal Open Market Committee, I enjoy engaging regularly with people from around the country to hear about on-the-ground economic conditions and to learn specifics about industries and communities. Such engagement is also a pathway to delivering better policy. It is important that households, businesses, and financial markets understand policymakers' views and assessments of economic conditions. Monetary policy is transmitted to the rest of the economy through financial market prices, such as long-term interest rates, which in turn affect the decisions of households and businesses. Changes in the target range for the federal funds rate are transmitted to short-term interest rates through arbitrage relationships. Short-term interest rates and central banks' communication, in turn, affect long-term interest rates through investors' expectations. According to the expectations theory of the term structure of interest rates, intermediate and long-term interest rates are the weighted average of expected future short-term interest rates. In addition, monetary policy affects risk premiums. Tighter monetary policy tends to reduce the willingness of investors to bear risk, making them less willing to invest in longer-term assets, which means that their return should be higher for investors to buy those assets. Former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke nicely summarized how important central bank communications is for the transmission of monetary policy by saying that, quote, monetary policy is 98% talk and only 2% action. While obviously that was hyperbole, the point is meaningful. Clear communications is an important part of the Fed policymaker's job. Today, the Fed communicates in a variety of ways, including policymaker speeches, Chair Powell's press conferences, and even through the Fed's social media channels. Clear and ample communication, however, has not always been the hallmark of the Fed. In the 1990s, cable news outlets would attempt to spot former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan walking into the building on the day of FOMC meetings. Commentators would pay careful attention to the size of his briefcase. The thought was that if the chair was advocating for a rate change, the briefcase would be bulging with documents to convince fellow policymakers. A light bag, on the contrary, would have signaled that a status quo policy decision was likely. Former Chair Greenspan seemed to value the element of surprise. In 1987, he famously quipped, and I'm quoting, "If I seem unduly clear to you, you must have misunderstood what I said." That said, during his tenure in later years, he initiated substantial changes in how Fed policymakers communicate with the public. Figure 1 shows a timeline of the steps taken towards increased transparency at the Fed since the 1990s. Beginning in 1993, the Fed started to publish FOMC minutes in their current form from the next meeting. Soon after that, the committee began releasing full transcripts of what was said at the meetings with a 5-year lag. The next year, the FOMC started to issue statements following meetings at which there was a change in the policy stance. Before such public statements, Fed watchers would need to observe movements in markets to determine if a policy change was being implemented. In subsequent years, the target federal funds rate was incorporated into these statements. And then in 1999, the FOMC started to publish statements after every meeting, regardless of whether there was a policy change. In 2004, the FOMC accelerated the release of the minutes to 3 weeks after the meeting. The Fed's transparency increased further under former Chair Bernanke. In November 2007, the FOMC began releasing the Summary of Economic Projections, commonly known as the SEP, which, as you may know, is a compilation of individual policymakers' forecasts for output, unemployment, and inflation. Since 2012, the SEP has also included information about policymakers' projections of the appropriate monetary policy, known as the dot plot. Former Chair Bernanke started holding press conferences after every FOMC meeting, every other FOMC meeting in 2011. In 2012, the FOMC published the Statement on Longer Run Goals and Monetary Policy Strategy, which is known as the Consensus Statement. That statement articulates the FOMC's framework for the conduct of monetary policy in pursuit of the dual mandate goals assigned by Congress: maximum employment and price stability. And since then, the FOMC has undertaken periodic public reviews of that statement. Under Chair Powell's tenure, starting in 2019, the chair's press conferences have been held after every FOMC meeting. Of course, the chair and other policymakers also regularly testify before Congress as required by law. And the Fed releases many reports and data, including the Monetary Policy Report, the Financial Stability Report, and the Supervision and Regulation Report. Policymakers' public appearances also help inform the public about the Fed's goals and its strategy to achieving those goals. Communication is not just about talking. It's also about listening. Policymakers listen to the steady beat of economic data, and the board and the reserve banks conduct numerous surveys of financial market participants, businesses, and families. Some of what we hear is summarized in the Beige Book, published 8 times a year. I also listen to experts and the public at events like this, and Fed Listens events, several of which are planned for later this year. Today, it is widely accepted that clear communication contributes greatly to effective transmission of monetary policy, especially because clear communication can affect the expected path of interest rates and financial conditions more generally. Former Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester studied this issue closely and discussed that when policymakers are clear about their policy goals, aspects of the economy that can and cannot be influenced by monetary policy, and the economic information that influences their forecasts and policy decisions, the public will have a better understanding of monetary policy. The public can then incorporate that information into their saving, borrowing, employment, and investment decisions. So, in that spirit of making sure the public is well informed, I will now share with you my outlook for the U.S. economy. Over the past 2 years, significant progress has been made towards the Fed's dual mandated goals of maximum employment and stable prices. Labor market conditions are solid, and inflation has come down, though it remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% goal. While the economy is in a solid position, surveys of consumers and businesses show heightened uncertainty about the economic outlook. It remains to be seen what these surveys imply about future spending and investment and the direction of the economy more broadly. The economy expanded at a solid pace at the end of last year, with gross domestic product rising at 2.4%, at a 2.4% annual rate in the fourth quarter, extending a period of steady growth, as you can see in Figure 2. While Fed policymakers and many private sector forecasters expect growth to continue, they broadly anticipate a slower pace of expansion this year. The SEP released after the March FOMC meeting, the median participant projected GDP to rise 1.7% this year and to move up a bit below 2% over the next 2 years. Resilient consumer spending has been the driving force of the current economic expansion. More recently, a few signs have emerged that suggest that some of the factors supporting last year's strong spending may be weakening. As you can see in Figure 3, retail and food service sales rose 0.2% in February after falling a sharp 1.2% in January. That slower pace of spending could reflect seasonality, poor weather, and expected cooling after the strong spending at the end of last year. Nonetheless, the readings at the start of this year suggest less support for growth from household spending in the first quarter. The most recent Beige Book stated that contacts reported consumer spending was lower on balance, with still solid demand for essential goods, but increased price sensitivity for discretionary items, particularly among lower income shoppers. Industrial production has increased for 3 straight months, including 0.7% advance in February, which was led by a rise in manufacturing output, particularly motor vehicles. Like consumer sentiment, however, readings on business sentiment have also slipped. The Beige Book reported some increases in manufacturing activity, though it noted concerns raised by firms, including chemical products and office equipment makers, about the potential effects of changes to trade policy. Some manufacturing contacts in this region, the 6th District, said that they expected demand to improve over the next 12 months, but also noted risk around policy changes and global uncertainty. If uncertainty persists or worsens, economic activity may be constrained. An important lesson learned in recent years, however, is that American consumers have been resilient, and a negative sentiment reported in the surveys does not necessarily translate into a slowdown in economic activity. With respect to the labor market, conditions remain solid. The unemployment rate has remained low and was 4.1% in February. As you can see in Figure 4, it has remained in a narrow range for the past year, consistent with broader evidence that labor market conditions have stabilized. That said, I anticipate that there could be some modest softening in the labor market this year. In the SEP projections, the median FOMC participant expected the unemployment rate to be 4.4% at the end of this year and 4.3% over the next 2 years. Payroll job gains have averaged nearly 200,000 per month over the past 6 months through February. We will, of course, get additional data tomorrow in the March jobs report. The pace of job gains has cooled from its post-pandemic peak, but layoffs remain low. Figure 5 shows that new applications for unemployment benefits are largely holding steady this year and running at rates consistent with pre-pandemic levels. Low layoffs are a reason why the unemployment rate has been steady even as hiring has moderated. Recently, there's been an increase in former federal government employees seeking unemployment benefits and some uptick in claims filings in certain regions affected by those layoffs. I will be monitoring incoming data closely and remain vigilant about potential spillover effects in sectors such as education, healthcare, and state governments. Looking at Figure 6, you can see the gap between job openings and unemployed people seeking work has held steady for several months. That is another sign that the labor market is well balanced. The gap has significantly narrowed from a peak in 2022 when the labor market was overheated. It is now consistent with 2019 readings when the labor market was also solid and inflation was low. Wages are growing faster than inflation and at a more sustainable pace than earlier in the pandemic recovery. The labor market is not a source of significant inflationary pressures. Inflation has come down a great deal over the past 2.5 years, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% objective. Looking at inflation shown in Figure 7, you see that the 12-month change in the personal consumption expenditure price index peaked at 7.2% in June of 2022. Since then, it has come down on an uneven path. In February, overall inflation was 2.5%, on a 12-month basis. Core PCE inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy costs, shown by the dashed red line, peaked at 5.6% in 2022. In February, it was 2.8%. While inflation is well down from its recent peak, the latest data have largely shown it moving sideways. The median FOMC participant forecasts overall PC inflation at 2.7% this year and 2.2% next year. In 2027, the median projection is at our 2% objective. The prospect of tariffs has consumers and businesses reporting that they expect higher inflation in the near term. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term inflationary expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. To better understand what is driving inflation, I think it can be helpful to look at some major components of changes in prices, as you can see in Figure 8. Outside of food and energy, goods inflation was negative last year, helping to support overall disinflation. In more recent months, goods inflation has turned positive. That may in part reflect trade policy or the anticipation of changes to trade policy. But capturing the exact cause is difficult. Services inflation, excluding housing, the dashed red line, has moderated from its peak, but remains elevated. Housing services inflation, the dotted purple line, in the current environment, I attach a higher degree of uncertainty to my projections than usual. The most recent SEP indicated that other FOMC participants also were quite uncertain about the outlook. A greater number of participants indicated that uncertainty around their projections of GDP growth, the unemployment rate, and inflation was higher than average over the past 20 years, compared to responses from previous SEPs around in December 2024. As I mentioned, consumer and business surveys show that much of the economic uncertainty they report is tied to recent developments in trade policy. Significant changes in trade, immigration, fiscal, and regulatory policies are in process. It will be crucial to evaluate the cumulative effect of these policy changes as we assess the economy and consider the path of monetary policy. Of course, at the Fed, we look at the whole of the economy and many factors that shape it. I supported the FOMC's decision to hold rates steady at our last policy meeting in March. Growth has remained solid so far, but has started to show some signs of slowing. Labor market conditions have remained stable through February, and progress on inflation has eased, but the outlook is uncertain. These conditions led me to favor holding the policy rate constant at what I view as a moderately restrictive level. The longer-term perspective provided by Figure 9 shows that the FOMC responded to elevated inflation in the post-pandemic period by raising the policy rate 5.25 percentage points over about 15 months, starting in March 2022. After the committee held the rate at that restrictive level for more than a year, progress on inflation allowed it to lower its policy rate by 1 full percentage point last year to its current level. The outcome of inflation moderating towards its 2% target without a large increase in unemployment was historically unusual but greatly welcomed. Thinking about the future path of policy, I will continue to assess the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. As we emphasize, monetary policy is not on a preset course. If the economy remains strong and inflation does not continue to move substantially towards our 2% target, the current policy restraint could be retained for longer. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly, or inflation were to fall more quickly than I anticipated, policy could be eased accordingly. In my view, there is no need to be in a hurry to make further policy rate adjustments. The current policy stance is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties we face in pursuing both sides of our dual mandate. Having provided you with my current economic outlook, I would like to conclude by circling back to where I started, with the value of central bank communication. The remainder of today's conference will touch on FOMC communications and monetary policy and monetary transmission, among other topics. In that sense, the remarks I have just given may become tomorrow's data point. I appreciate the pursuit of research like that presented today, which helps us gain further insight into a wide range of topics relevant to monetary policy making. Thank you for your time. I wish you a productive and informative remainder of the conference.
Thank you. So a reminder, there's QR codes on your tables. If you shoot it with your phone, you can enter questions on that website, and they will be fed to my iPad here, and we'll have a bit of a conversation. So while we're waiting for those to percolate, a lot of news on trade policy yesterday. Curious what your thoughts are.
Well, first, I'd like to make sure I emphasize that any remarks I make are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or the FOMC. So I'm speaking on my own behalf. Yes, there were announcements made yesterday about policy, but I think it's still the case that there remains a substantial amount of uncertainty around trade. And this level of uncertainty, of course, can weigh on households and businesses' investment and spending decisions. So we're in a situation where it's going to be important to take our time and think carefully about their impact. Now, in terms of my thoughts around policy changes that elected officials may propose and implement, it's not the case that I focus on any one policy. What I try to focus on is the whole collective of policies that have been proposed and may be implemented, including with respect to other types of fiscal policy, immigration, and regulatory policy. So because of our mandate to focus on, at the aggregate level, on the labor market and price stability, it's really the net effect of a whole collection of policies that are most important for my thinking about the conduct of monetary policy.
So following up a little bit on that, tell us a little bit about your day-to-day. How do you stay on top of everything that's happening? Data, events, and synthesize the net effect and kind of think about what your assessment of the outlook looks like.
Well, just like everyone in this room, and I'm thinking more broadly, I wake up in the morning and the first thing I do is I look at my phone to see what is currently the state of announcements. But it is the case that as policymakers, we have access to many news feeds and sorts of real-time market information that we try to stay abreast of. And always is a process of trying to synthesize all of what's going on. And so the staff at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, like at the banks, are working very hard in real time to give us their best read as on the implications of that day's developments. And then as a policymaker, what I try to do is to keep in mind this broader frame, okay, and to not, in my own thinking, overreact to what may be proposed today versus tomorrow. And also keep in mind that, okay, how do I integrate this new information to what may happen with regulatory policy, what may happen with immigration policy, what may happen to various fiscal policy proposals on Capitol Hill and things of that sort. So my view is that I take this collection of information as given and then say, okay, given those policies that may actually be implemented, how does this translate into our outcome variables that we care so much about? That is price stability and or inflation and its impact on the labor market. And then that's what starts to shape my thinking about policy and the policy path going forward.
Wonderful. So we have a question from the audience. This is a little bit of a follow-up, but we're going to look longer term. What might be some challenges to monetary policy in the longer run, stemming, for instance, from technological advances such as AI and its potential effect on financial markets?
Oh, okay. Well, that's related to our first topic this morning. So what's so intriguing about AI is whether or not it will change the long run rate of productivity growth. Okay, so let me give you a little backdrop here. So for the longest time up until the pandemic, the rule of thumb that I had in my mind was that on average, productivity growth is 1.5% a year. Okay, that's just like hardwired into my mind. Okay, but over the last 5 years or so, that's ticked up a little bit to say 1.9%. Okay, but that was before the breakthroughs associated with AI. So it would be way too soon to attribute that uptick to AI. So now going forward, a question in my mind is, well, is that higher level of productivity that we've observed over the last 5 years, an average of about 1.9%, is that going to persist going forward, or are we going to adjust back down towards our longer run path of productivity growth? And the way AI comes into this is that there has historically always been something that has allowed us to grow at 1.5% in terms of productivity growth. So is that going to be AI, or is AI going to engender incremental growth over and above that? Okay, so that's what I as a policymaker need to know, because it will shape my expectations of what the long run growth potential of the economy is. And if it's going to be higher, then of course, as a monetary policymaker, given our dual mandate, productivity growth is like the holy grail. That's the gift from heaven that would allow us to more easily have price stability with maximum employment. Now, that's a very long answer to a short question, but that's all that comes to mind when I think about AI. Is it going to be that increment to productivity growth? Or is it simply that most recent thing that's going to allow us to continue to grow at 1.5%? Productivity growth. I don't know the answer to that question, but only time will tell.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Right. And
all these AI researchers out there, maybe
I heard research topic ideas, so right. So I'm going to bring AI a little closer to home. We also have a question. What are some implications of advances in large language models or text and visual analysis for how central bankers deliver their communications?
Right. Well, let me say I am very aware that my speeches are being analyzed using these techniques, but more importantly, the chair's speeches are being analyzed, and we are aware of the red line edits that everyone is studying. So in terms of how I communicate, the knowledge that textual analysis is going on has not actually changed the challenge that I face. And that challenge is to be as clear as possible in my language so that the maximum number of people are able to understand how I am thinking about policy. And so that's what I'm focused on when I speak. And I think the beauty of this new technology is that we have 19 members on the FOMC who are speaking about the economy and the things that they're focused on. And so what the new technology allows the public to do is to synthesize that information so as to get a better sense of the direction of policy. And one thing I want to mention in this regard, and it's related to maybe the first question you asked, is that, what matters a lot to me as a monetary policymaker are long-term inflationary expectations. Okay, that's very important, because as long as they're anchored, I think it is easier for to achieve our dual mandate. And so to the extent that people are able to understand what policy is doing, the things that cause policy to adjust, and that feeds into their formation of long-term inflationary expectations and our credibility, I think that's a good thing.
Wonderful. So we have a lot of financial economists in the audience here and perhaps online as well. So a question is, another aspect of Fed monetary policy is the size and composition of the Fed's balance sheet. So asking, how do you think about the role of the balance sheet in monetary policy? And it goes a little farther, your views on appropriate policy going forward. So
appropriate policy. Okay, so so let me provide a little bit of context here, just for myself and maybe for the audience. It is the case that currently the Fed is conducting what we would call quantitative tightening. Okay, we announced in January of 2022 that we would start to shrink the size of the balance sheet, and that we had a plan for how that would be done over time. And we are executing that plan. We said then that as we made the transition from a regime of abundant reserves to ample, that we would gradually slow the pace as we started to get to what we thought might be an ample level of reserves. Now, of course, that precise level of reserves is not known. And so it makes sense that as you are reducing the size of the balance sheet, you would slow the pace. And that's, we started slowing the pace in June of last year. And again, in March, we announced that we would be slowing it. I view that as something that can happen in the background and in an orderly way. It's been announced in terms of what the levels are for the reduction of assets held by the Fed. And in terms of the conduct of monetary policy, the primary tool that we use is the target range for the federal funds rate. And as long as what's happening with the balance sheet is orderly, it can remain in the background. The rate at which we approach ample reserves in no way affects the ultimate size of the balance sheet. So it's just really a matter of wanting it to proceed, the quantitative tightening, to proceed in an orderly way as we approach ample reserves.
So earlier you mentioned a whole array of policy issues that you're particularly interested in and the net effect of them, and how you're going to synthesize that. So we're in a room of researchers, probably have a bunch online. Are there any other topics top of mind? We talked a little bit about AI and productivity that you would really appreciate more research on. What are the things that would be particularly useful to you in your role?
Well, I want to pick up on a comment that was made in the earlier meeting, earlier in this session, and it had to do with the transmission of monetary policy in the post-financial crisis era. Okay, I believe that not only in the post-financial market era, but also maybe in the post-pandemic era, that there could have been structural changes in the economy and the way in which financial markets work. And so if you believe that's possible, then the question becomes, well, how did those changes impact, if at all, the transmission of monetary policy with respect to its speed and impact? And those are highly salient questions that me as a policymaker always want to understand, because when you think about trying to calibrate or recalibrate monetary policy, you can't help but think about where the impacts are felt, how responsive private actors are to what we're doing, and the timing, right? So while we can say that there are long and variable lags in terms of the effects of monetary policy, that phrase can't be a substitute for rigorous knowledge and research around what is actually going more likely to happen and when. And so any new research related to that is helpful. And so that would be my response to that.
Okay, we're going to end with a little more of a personal question. As an academic, what parts of the vice chair role were you most prepared for, and what was your biggest surprise?
Okay, well, the vice chair's role. Okay, so I won't talk about my administrative. Okay, first I would say, let me add on to that question by saying this. So I'm a former dean of the faculty, and so I think that sort of led me also to becoming the administrative governor also, in addition to being vice chair. And so I feel luckily to have been a dean in an academic institution, because that presented me with a number of challenges that had to do with policy in terms of running and facilitating or assisting in the running of a large organization. And so that skill set I found to be very transferable. So I'm happy about that. Now, the thing that I have found most surprising is that, you know, on the committee, the FOMC, you know, we really have 19 independent voices. And so just like you in this room, I have to make sure I read the speeches of my colleagues to know how they're thinking about things. So I'm trying to keep up like everyone else because it's not a coordinated thing. And so that's something that I enjoy doing, and I wouldn't have necessarily expected to have to do, but that's the way it is. And I think it's good because we have 19 very independent minds who are looking at the economy in a very serious and rigorous way. And people are bringing different perspectives to the challenge. And so for me, it's another source of information about the economy that I have to keep up on.
We can all see it in the dot plot.
Exactly. Exactly. I get the dot plot like everyone else. Wow.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. So it's a joy to be here.